Outa-space. Because artists lack the time, resources, and places to make creative work. Outa-space. Because the street, the squares, and all the common places we mix in are where we need to decide our future. Outa-space. Because we need to take our minds above the clouds to look down on our planet, to dream, to wonder, but also to see everything in the context of everything else. Hi, I am RobmacDonald, your in-flight community communication device. We hope you have a pleasant experience with us today. You can leave an optional tip in the links below. Art must be free. But the rent is not, so all support is welcome. Series 5. Far Right. Too Far. Episode 1. Lost at Sea? Part 1 and 2.
Okay, so welcome to Out of Space podcast. First of all, I want to apologise. The show has not been on for 2 years, and I'm now relaunching the show. It's going to be slightly different, and this show is different than what it's going to be, if that makes sense. So what I intend to do today with this show is to explain to you the various changes the show is going to have and the reasons why. First of all, why the show has not been running for 2 years, but also why the show is now going to start again and what that means to me and what purpose it serves and various reasons like that. So really there's two things to start with. The first is a whole set of personal questions, which I'm going to do later. I'm not going to do that first because I don't want to go into a big personal, oh my God, me kind of thing. But there is a lot of stuff that's been going on in my life in the last 2 years that meant this show didn't happen. I am going to talk about that. Some of you might find that more interesting than anything else, and some of you might be thoroughly bored with that part of this podcast. So that's going to be a second part, and I'm going to leave that separate, and I will let you know when that part starts. I think it'll be obvious, but I'll let you know. The first part is going to be, I'm going to explain a little bit of an introduction about how I want this new show to be, and what the old show was and why it's changing. I'm also going to talk about some of the inspirations I have for relaunching this show and the direction I want it to go in. So the first thing to say is some of you might be listening to this for the first time. But this is actually Series 5. I don't know exactly how many shows that means, but normally the series have been approximately 10 shows each, some less, some more. So this takes me up to about 40 odd shows that I've done. And the show before was very clearly called Outa-space International Arts and Class Struggle podcast. Now, the important thing to understand is that show, that podcast, was about me exploring some big political questions that I had about the role of art in our society and the role of art in the class struggle. That is the class struggle. For me, that means how to get rid of capitalism, which I find is the main cause to all the ills of humanity. There's lots of little side shows to that, but that was the main focus of the first 4 series. I wanted to talk and ask different artists internationally about what they thought. And while I did that, I tested out my own thinkings. And I came to a number of conclusions, which I'll explain very briefly now, but they will develop throughout this series, I think. But I think they're clear enough in my mind that those four series, this series doesn't have to be about them. So what did I learn from the first series? Well, first of all, I realized that art was about the human spirit fighting against the alienation of capitalism. It was very much, for me personally, I was an artist because I was struggling to be a human being. I also learned very clearly that my political activism, which has been 40 years strong, was the same as my artistic expression. And much of that came together in various projects, which I will talk about later on. But the equation of both things being one and the same really taught me that art and the struggle for real art, if you like, or free art, or whichever expression you want to be, art for me, and I believe for many other people, was a struggle to express themselves as human beings. And for me, I also added the question of class consciousness into that, because I think that is an important thing to understand the role of the working class and how that can be an agent of social change and where that fitted in with art. The other question that I understood from the first 4 series was that art in itself was a choice. And what I mean by that is that the external input that society gives an individual, the society, everything, the foundational base, the economy, all those sort of Marxian ways you could also look at the situation, that art came down to collectively and individually a question of choices, of which way you would choose to act under certain circumstances. Would you choose route A? Would you choose route B? Would you choose route C, A, B, C, D, or whatever combination you wanted to make? And therefore, art was art was a simple human response. It always has been, and this was before capitalism. And again, I think this roots back to the idea that art is a very fundamental part of what it means to be a human being. I obviously have a strong sense of the role of science. Some people say art and science are brother and sister, or use those kind of analogies. I think they do interact super close, and they are the double pillars of progressive humanity. That's why I have a serious interest in modern science questions. It's why this podcast is partly called Outa-space. And my interest in cosmology and all things scientific, quantum mechanics to the large questions of the day, these all feed into my theoretical political thoughts, my artistic theoretical thoughts, and into my very being. I try and mix the two. So you might think, if you know me, that I listen to art podcasts myself, or I go to art galleries, or I think about art all the time, or you think I'm always on a demonstration, I'm always trying to fight some campaign. Both of those things are part of me, but actually the thing that's really me is the me that goes to bed every single night and listens intensely to ideas, the modern scientific ideas of the day, and how they actually are the cutting edge of humanity, whether that's good or a bad thing, or whether they're loony ideas or not. The debate within the cutting edge of science is something that super interests me, because I think that mixed with the expression of being an artist is the clearest way to be progressive as a human being. So really, that was what the first show was all about. Now, that's something that was concluded for me. Now, there's a whole other side, which I've said at the beginning that I will explain, which is a personal side, not irrelevant to why this podcast has come back. But most importantly, I think in the first 4 series of this podcast, I had to ask those questions. And for the last 2 years, something else has been happening to me, which again, I tease you, will explain a little later. Okay, so how will this podcast be? First of all, I know some of you listened before, and I'm extremely grateful, and very grateful for the people who donated on Patreon to make sure I could do it to start with. And I'm super grateful for those who continued to pay me on Patreon, even though the podcast had gone dormant. And so partly the relaunch, very small part, is because I owe. I owe some podcasts and quite a few. And I still want people to give me money for Patreon so that I can do my creative work. But the most important thing is to explain how, at this stage at least, how this show is going to be different or the same as the previous shows for those people who knew it. And for those people who don't know it, you'll get an idea of what to expect in the future. First thing to say is what you won't get in the future is a long chat by me like this. I will talk a lot because I like to talk, I like to think, I like to express my opinions. But the show is fundamentally about the collectivization of ideas, of collective thought, of having interviews with different people, and then having various discussions around that. It's also around showing other people's art, whether it be I actually play the song of the artist I'm talking to, or use their picture in the promotion, or in some way I'm publicizing the work that they do, and finding out why they do it. That is really interesting to me, but also I think is enlightening to anybody who thinks about the questions of art and politics and the like. So that will continue. I'm thinking of changing the format. Before, the format was very much one long interview, and then a bit of analysis about that, and then maybe their song or whatever it was. I'm thinking this time to have shorter interviews. Haven't yet fully decided that because this is the first show. This is the first show where I'm exploring, when I'm talking live now. And as I talk, I create. And as I create, I think, and I might change my direction. But the idea is to have on the show people from different countries, but more than one person giving an expression of that country. So maybe a more person who's more directed on terms of political activity, and then maybe a person who's more directed on their artistic expression, but coming from the same place, coming from the same leftward leaning perspective, coming from the anti-capitalist perspective, coming from the perspective of needing to change society, but hearing from the artist political thoughts and hearing the political person's artistic thoughts, and trying to mix it up a little bit to get a little bit more sort of discussion, if you like, out of what we need to do to change the world. So there would be a format change there, I think. The other change will be that it was very much a magazine show in general last time, and it came out every week. This podcast is very unlikely to come out every week. It's going to be more irregular. My aim is to be minimum of monthly. If I get in the swing, it may turn out to be weekly again. If I get enough patron donations and the like, then I will do a lot more. But one thing I learned in the last time, it's an enormous amount of work to put a good show together, and there's no point doing a shit show. So I want to think more deeply and more questioning about how I produce that show, but also I want to put myself under less stress. So What will the new show be about? Well, it'll still be about international arts. It'll still be about artists. It'll still be about politics. It'll still be about class struggle. It'll still be about the people that are involved. So that would be the basic format of this series 5. I'll explain a bit more detail about where my aims are for that in a moment. But I also am thinking that I want to, let's say, do some more shows like this, some more solo shows, or shows like what we called one-word podcasts, which I did with Paranoid Paul. I want to do some of those when they're correct to do. And so it might be that the show won't always be the same, because I don't like holding to rigid formulas. I like to change things around. I do like the magazine format of the show, where I interview somebody and then I play their art and then I discuss it. But I don't want to limit myself to that. So at this stage, I'm not completely sure how that part is going to play out. But for certain, it'll be part of it. The other thing that I want to keep, which was a lot of fun, was the space station. Which was, after I'd done the interview with the artist or political activist, I would often go up to the space station, where most times, not all the time, I would be up there with my co-presenter, Paranoid Paul. I want to still do that, probably not as regular as before, or maybe not just always with Paul, although Paul is fantastic and a great thinker. And those 10 minutes of analysing the interview that I've just did was always very eye-opening, because although me and Paul are very similar, we also, enjoy clashing with ideas. So that one can continue. But I also want to introduce a group of people called Informal Revolutionaries. And this is a group of people who I spend once a month having discussions with, where we discuss very much the crisis of society and also the crisis of the left's inability to change society. And I want to, bit by bit, introduce this team of lovely people to you. Again, not completely sure how I'm going to do that, and maybe they want to be more or less involved, but very much they've been important to me over the last couple of years, which I will explain again later a bit more. But there will be some extra discussion about the topic raised in each podcast. So, yeah. That's where the show's going to be going. My inspirations, well, fundamentally, I've read a couple of books recently which have, really woken me. No pun intended on the word. To some realities in our society. They've reawoken my passion for the need to change society. One of them was Naomi Klein's book, Doppelganger, which has been a fantastic read, and I recommend. But it was a good analysis of the social media, internet age that we're in, and how conspiracy theories and the far right grow under those conditions. And so a large part of this series is going to be on that question. It wasn't just Naomi's book that inspired me. It's something I've always thought about, but I think it's a particularly well written and clear book about the age we're in. I will discuss that book in an episode in the future. But that book inspired me to really deeply think about those questions a little bit more, about how the mirror world works, how the conspiracy world works. I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes at all. I want to keep the show real. I want to keep the show very much about what people are doing. But there's some really serious thinking that we need to do as humanity on that question. I also want to introduce a bit more science, a little bit more thinking about how scientific ideas like quantum mechanics and general theories of relativity and all these things affect our social thinking. But the far right question, I'm thinking of naming it the series Far Right Too Far, is major. We're in a crisis in the world in many, many ways. We've been there before, but this is particular. And the far right is growing. And what do we do about that? Do we just expect that there'll be some class struggle that will cut across it? Or do we take seriously the dangers of, as Naomi Klein put it, of diagonalism, of how the far right incorporate much of the left's language and things like that? So a lot of the show, I want to bring out what is the methods and agendas of the far right and how we on the left, because that's clearly where I am, how we are not or how we are tackling that. And that will be a discussion topic. That's one of the questions I want answered for me from this series. I don't have that concluded. I don't think it's particularly healthy to ever be concluded. I think you always have to have a open mind, but that is very much one of the thematical subjects. There's a thematical subjects. Doesn't sound like very good use of words there, but that is one of the lines of thought that I want this podcast to explore. I also want through that to reach artists and say it's time for us to organize. It's always been a big part of my political and artistic expression, but very much I want to build a artist international network, and I will explain that more clearly in future episodes, in future interviews. But it's the time now that creative people who are consciously creative and consciously call themselves artists, it is now the time that we step forward. That's not to say that political activists don't have a role or whatever, but I believe that the artist who recognizes themselves consciously as an artist has a critical role to play in changing the dynamics of the political situation. And therefore, I think if we want unity of struggle to get rid of the far right and to get rid of capitalism, one of the first steps that we can take is the artist can play a pivotal role in kicking our asses. I think artists, although full of ego and full of problems in and of themselves, are people who can pull us together. Because at the bottom, I believe, of their hearts and of their drive is the need for humanity. And therefore, in a humanistic kind of way, I think there's a super important role to play. And therefore, the uniting of artists internationally in some kind of program or manifesto is clear on my agenda. I'll develop that a little bit later. Okay, so there's some of the ideas of what the podcast will be, and what the, if you like, the political and maybe the artistic link. So in that sense, the show's not that much different than it was before. There is a difference though, and this will be the second part that I explain. And one of the things that I have entered in a more conscious way recently is the questions of neurodiversity and what that means for humanity. The question, I've also read some very interesting literature and books, which I will recommend during the episodes as well, on autism, on ADHD, on various different conditions, on what is neurotypical. I find that this debate, and potentially a debate that runs alongside it on identity politics, something that I have had to engage with from a young age without realizing it, and now it's very topical. Identity politics is obviously very topical and has been for some time, and the question of neurodiversity is also rapidly growing alongside many other struggles. And I think there is a need to understand these questions and where they fit in to the overall struggle to change things. So running alongside this new series will be thoughts on that question, particularly on neurodiversity and potentially on how I understand myself, which leads me nicely on to why did this podcast disappear for 2 years? Where have I been? What happened to me? What reasons did I have for not doing this podcast anymore? And what reasons do I have personally for bringing them back? But that is going to be another recording. As I've done this very much as a stream of consciousness, I will probably do that very much as a stream of consciousness. So let's just have a small pause, and then I will come back to the personal reasons why Outa-space podcast is back.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Just a quick update on our progress. We left the Earth's atmosphere some time ago with an escape velocity of excess of 11.19 kilometers per second. In about 100 kilometers or so we will begin our descent to the space station, where part 2 of this podcast will continue. The emotion on our arrival is expected to be around a comfortable 20 degrees, although it's possible there will be some conflicts as we come into dock, so please keep your seatbelts fastened. I will now pass you back to Robbie Bot of our wonderful in-flight community communication team. I hope you have enjoyed flying with Outa-space today, and we wish you a pleasant onward journey.
Dear fellow travelers, on behalf of the captain and the crew, we welcome you to part 2 of this podcast. You may experience some personal release. On entering the space station, the sensation is perfectly normal. If you find some discomfort, we recommend a cup of chamomile tea and an early night on your return. We hope you have a pleasant stay, and we'll see you in approximately 20 minutes.
Okay then, welcome back to part 2 of this podcast. Well, first of all, I'll start this part the same as I started the other, by saying sorry. God, that guy goes on. So I'm going to try and be a little bit sharper with this second part and get straight to the point. I'm going to do that for a couple of reasons. One is because that first part was very long, and if you're still with me, I'm surprised. But the second reason is that I've also had this second part sitting in my mind for weeks in weeks on to happen, but for months, thinking about what I would say in such a podcast, because it's the personal part. It's the part where I spill the beans. Well, I'm probably going to disappoint you a little bit with that, but I'm going to try, and I'm going to try and be as sharp as I can and to the point as I can, because anything that I do say now can obviously be expanded on in later podcasts. So first of all, the theme of this series is far right to far, but I could also have called it far left, far fucked. And quite honestly, I have reached a point in my political activism where I'm no longer happy to be part of a small group. I'm no longer part to be in these small groups that exist today that are very undemocratic, they're sectarian, they're up their arses, and the like. Now, I'm saying that very strongly to catch your attention, because I played a large part in being in a hard control revolutionary vanguard group for over 30 years, and I don't regret a second. But I believe I've come and learnt something after that experience. It has given me so much to be so politically active and so driven, but it has also given me a fair few scars. And so I don't want to dictate to anybody how we think we should change the world, but I know that for me, my mind has changed about how we can do that. The people that I'm referring to, let's say, some of them are truly wonderful people and will play an important role, I believe, in changing society. But I believe the left has got to change. It needs a serious kick up the arse. I'm not the one to do that alone, but I want this podcast to be, a small part in trying to get us to think properly, and to cut out the sectarianism, to move away from a small-minded organizational direction and think about the bigger picture and how we actually need to build a socialist revolution to rid ourselves of capitalism. So I believe there's a lot of mistakes that I've played a part in my life. There's a lot of good things I've done too. I want the podcast and to express that in Series 5 and beyond. And I want to interview those people that probably don't agree with me on that. So the most important thing from the personal angle is I want to express, I'm going to try and bravely step out of a box that I thought I wasn't in. But I found myself to be inside. And anybody on the far left will know exactly the kind of things I'm talking about. And some of you will wish I hadn't started talking about it. And some of you will be very happy. And maybe some of you won't care at all. So that is the first part of my personal experience, that over the last 35 or even 40 years of political activity, I've come to a point of not physical or mental exhaustion, but a kind of exhaustion where things have just got to change. The crisis in the world is so big, and the answers that we've got are not good enough. So although I'm going to focus on fighting the far right and questions of where capitalism is inhumane and needs to be changed, I'm also going to talk, I hope, quite strongly about ideas that we could be looking at how to change things in a different way, because fundamentally, as an artist and as a human being, I think we've got nothing left but to be creative about the problems that face humanity. The second personal thing that's changed in my life, I should say, actually, just on finishing, where did the podcast go? Well, the podcast went because for the last 2 or 3 years, because I was exhausted. I was run out in many ways of these a far left group, or a number of them, which left me with those scars that I've mentioned, but also left me with some anger that needs to be expressed, and some pain too that also needs to be expressed. Anyway, that was the more political point that I wanted to make. And of course, I'm not being as sharp as I promised you at the beginning. And that's because I'm doing things as a stream of consciousness, because I think it's the most easiest way to be honest. If I over prepare what I say, then I probably won't say anything of much interest. The second personal thing that was massive in the last couple of years was the finishing of the Solidarity Park monument. Now, I'm going to make a separate episode on that whole process because it's far too much to go into here. But I think it's enough to say at this stage that I dedicated myself 1000%. I know that's not mathematically possible, but to that project and to make it happen. It was a wonderful thing to do. The project was completed. It was a personal ambition of mine to do such a large piece of public art, and I'm extremely proud of it. I'm more proud of it because it continues, and it's involved a lot of people, which is part of the art form of community art that I wanted to develop. I didn't want community art like a pottery class on a Tuesday night. I wanted community art which had something to say for itself and had a life that would continue. Now, What is Solidarity Park, some of you might ask? Well, then look on the internet, see if you can find Solidarity Park, put my name, Rob MacDonald, and you might just find a few things. I'm not going to explain more about the project than that, apart from to say that the personal price I paid to achieve that project, that monument, was high. High in many ways I don't still fully understand, but left me almost not finishing the project. I had a mini stroke just 3 or 4 months before the end. I had about 10 different full-time jobs running at the same time as trying to build a life achievement type project, and I ran aground. I was, as the podcast is called, I was lost at sea. Interestingly, because the monument is about international brigaders who died at sea, and all the important political things that had, what I was left with at the end was being fairly broken. Because I'd pushed myself to the absolute limit, which is something I wanted to do, but left me after the stroke with an extremely hard 3 or 4 months to finish the project, which, because of the collectiveness of that project, it was able to be completed, and I'm happy for it. I'm super happy as well that project continues now in the form of the festival and its role hopefully in uniting people on the anti-fascist left to come together and to try to change the world. And the festival and all the Solidarity Park things will feature in this podcast. Obviously, it's a big personal thing, but the personal thing to really say is the damage that it caused me. Not Solidarity Park itself, not the monument itself, but by my approach to life up until that point. And that's the personal side here that I've had to come to terms with, and I've had to analyse in a very serious way. And it's one of the reasons why this podcast is back, because when I was lying in the hospital bed with an unfinished monument that I promised to every single person that I knew, I wondered how the fuck I was going to get myself out of the situation. I agreed with myself in that moment that I needed to change hugely. There's a lot of things that I needed to change. And I came up eventually with 4 things that I was going to do. After I finished the monument, that is, because it took about 3 or 4 months to actually do that and to deliver the first festival. But after that, I came to some personal realizations. The first one was to look after my health and make that a priority. And that included being closer to friends, being closer to family. That included eating decent food. That included giving up alcohol. That included a general well-being manifesto for myself. Which I have to say I have largely done. I don't drink anymore, apart from the odd beer now, once or twice, but I gave up completely for 14 months. I was alcohol dependent in my life, for sure, for 30 or 40 years. And I made some big changes. I still don't eat as well as I should, and there are still things I could do, but I think my general idea that well-being had to be my priority number 1 was important. A part of that was to be alive and stay healthy, not just for myself, but for the people that I loved and who relied on me. And I felt a huge responsibility. That was number 1 objective. I believe that in the 2 years now since my mini stroke, I believe that I've more or less achieved a healthier mind and lifestyle. Not completely by any means at all, but I'm certainly think about it often. Number 2 is I told myself time to get a regular job. Being a revolutionary artist is not a stable for a 53-year-old plus man. To cut a long story short, I put a huge amount of effort into becoming a teacher. An English teacher, because I live in Spain, or in Catalonia, And I passed many exams and I did a lot of work. I retrained myself. I got a really good job, and that went pear-shaped. And it went pear-shaped for many reasons. And that is the reason why in the first part of the podcast, I talked about the importance of looking at neurodiversities, because I identified as somebody who was dyslexic. I even did a podcast on it in the first, I think it was in series 3, I'm not sure, with Paul. And I saw it as a superpower, and I thought that was me dealing with certain neurodiverse questions. But the process of finishing the monument and promising myself that I would get a proper job, I found that led me into a deep crisis. It took some while to unwind, and today I'm resigning from that job. And I've been on the sick for some time, and it's time to move on. And it didn't work out. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of why, because I think I would go on too long, but I think it's important enough to mention this, because I think it's going to be a personal reflection throughout this podcast of what neurodiversity means, what it means to me. And the song, well, I'll come to the song in a minute. I'm rambling. So that's the second thing I promised myself, a regular job. Well, I didn't achieve that. I achieved a healthier lifestyle, objective number 1, but objective number 2, to get a regular job, went wrong. Objective number 3 was to keep Solidarity Park going. I achieved that with lots of help. The second festival in 2023 was really good, and the festival for 2024 is looking fantastic, and the team is growing, and we've had some growing pains, but I am surrounded by wonderful people in that project. Not just right next to me working hard in it, but at distance as well, and a lovely community is growing up around that project. And I'm very proud to be a part of it, and I'm very proud that people are taking that project for themselves. So I achieved to keep that project going, and hopefully it will fly on its own. And then the fourth thing that I promised myself was to do some writing. And I still promised myself to do that, and I wasn't allowed to do it. I told myself you can do the first 3 things, but not the fourth thing. And then when number 2 collapsed, which was to get a regular job, I thought, well, you know what? Why don't I actually now have a go at number 4? Because I want to do some writing and thinking. And that is why this podcast is back, because for me to write is a way of delivering to myself messages. It's a way of expression. It's a way of trying to clarify ideas. And I do it on paper. I've been a prolific writer of poetry. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's awful, but I have done a lot. At least 4,000 poems that I've written in my life, normally at times of stress, but not always. And so I want to write something serious. I want to put this life experience up to now into something worthwhile. But because of the aforementioned dyslexia and those kind of neurodiverse questions, I found that pretty hard to contemplate. And it's not the first time I've tried to do it. But I believe the podcast is a very good way for me to be able to write, and to write collectively with the stories of other people. So this podcast is back because I want to do research into writing, and that is a lot of what the podcast will be about, and why I was lost at sea, if you like, politically and health-wise. And now, as an artist, I need to do new things, and I believe that this podcast represents that. So that's it, really. There's more juicy stuff I could tell you, quite a lot actually, and I know where a lot of skeletons are buried, and I know some interesting things about myself and about the world in general. Maybe I'll bring those into the podcast in the next couple of months, maybe I won't. So I'll just finish, because normally on the podcast I show somebody's art, or we play some music of an artist. This podcast has been very much me on my own. me being very egotistical, maybe. Lots of negative words like that come to mind. If you've listened to it this far, I really appreciate it. But I need to shed some crap off myself. And the only way I can do it is by doing it in public. And if nobody listens to this, all the better. But if you have listened this far, I really appreciate it. And the art this week, this episode, let's say, is all from me. Well, not entirely all from me, but the image from the poster of the sea, the poster for the graphics for this podcast is of a sea, crashing waves. That was painted by me. I'm not an artist of that character, but while I was ill after the stroke that I had before I finished the monument, I struggled to finish that monument, but I had some experiences with the sea. Sometimes in the car when I was driving up and I was feeling so sick, I had to turn around, but I could always see the sea because it's the coastal road of the Mediterranean that I drove up to get to the monument. And then when I could no longer drive, I used to take the train, and the train line went along part the sea. So that is my attempt at acrylic painting. I don't try and make out that it's good, but it is fully expressional of this podcast, and that's why it's the podcast image for this episode. And then finally, what's the music of this episode? Well, the music of this episode is a song done by a band that I was in 20 plus years ago. Time loses me at this present moment. Called Parallax. I was in a band with close mates from the age of 17 to my mid-30s. It took many forms, but the larger form was called Parallax. It had different lineups, and I used to be the drummer in that band, and that was one of my major political and artistic expressions of the time. I also used to write a lot of poetry, and the band used to use my poems sometimes as songs for the band. Something I was very happy to do. I very rarely sang myself, and I didn't necessarily create the lyrical dimension to it. I would write the poem and then that would be taken away. In the course of recovery, which is what I've had to do in the last couple of years, and certainly recently after having quite a meltdown, losing a job that I thought was the most important thing that I did, a lot of things came back to my mind that I'd done previously. And one of the things that came back to my mind was a lot of poems that I'd written. And then one particular poem stuck in my head, which was Hyper Movement, which was turned into a song, which the band Parallax recorded in approximately 1994. And it was a song that was about me not being able to complete an English university degree because of the academic style that it was taught to me in. Let's call it that for now. I think we'll have to develop that point. But I was exhausted by it, and I dropped out, and that caused quite a big crisis for me at the time. But this song was written about being angry, and it was also written about the complexities of being dyslexic and being in love with English language and communication. But I'll let the song speak for itself. I'm not going to play it directly from this video. It will be in the links because the song was recorded some 20 years ago. And with the permission of the band, I did a new video for it, which was made a couple of weeks ago. And I wanted to make it into a video format because at the time of that band, we didn't really have the social media of today, or even the tools for somebody like me with no real video and recording skills to be able to put together. But I learned within a couple of hours and used certain images and managed to express that song in a deeper way. And why I'm finishing on that is because you should listen to yourself. Everybody should listen to themselves. I'm fortunate enough to have written a poem about myself 30 years ago, which is talking to me today. And if you hear yourself in the past talking to yourself today and reminding yourself of what is wrong with you or not wrong with you, to be more precise, and the things that frustrate you and the attitude of freedom and liberation that you need to take, then I think the most important thing is, if we're going to change, we have to be honest. We have to be honest with ourselves. And the first thing about being honest with ourselves is listening to our own consciousness. And certainly I didn't do that for much of my life. But 20 years ago, there was a song recorded that I wrote 5 years before that, which was telling me today how to act. And so I finish with that, the song Hyper Movement. Thank you very much for listening to me today. I assure you that the rest of the podcast in this series will not be me rambling on for an hour. If you've stuck with me this long, I love you and I appreciate your time. And, well, let's shut up. Let's get on with it. Download and have a listen to Hyper Movement on YouTube.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the captain and crew, we wish you a pleasant onward journey. You will find the links as you leave the podcast. Thank you for your attention. Please be advised, if you find breathing difficult when leaving the space station, this is normal when leaving a safe bubble. Please remember to take care of each other.